Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry for being a little loud. I know it's the afternoon, you all had lunch. Hopefully you would have had some coffee. It's a pleasure to have you among us and to be able to kick a session on actually what the Amadeus Institute is all about, namely a think tank. And for that, a think tank of the South, so that's also another trend. But what we're going to talk about in this session is really the evolution of think tanks from the beginning until the current disruption, where we basically see precipitation of history of events, and we're going to see how think tanks are both a cause and a consequence for a disruption, and how think tanks position themselves in that environment. And we have an outstanding panel ranging several continents and going back in history. I mean, we have it all gathered here today. And I'm really happy to see that I'm going to introduce the panelists one by one, and we go back to the origin of the think tanks, to the latest disruptions that think tanks have made, for that matter. And I'm very happy to be able to introduce our distinguished panel, starting from my left, with Mr. Gustavo Martinez from the Public Affairs Council of International Relations from the Republic of Argentina. Welcome to Morocco. It's a pleasure to have you among us. You are obviously director of Argentine 2.0, Think 2.0, so we look forward to be able to see basically what kind of, what entails in 2.0, because we have obviously 4.0, and so that's not, we just cannot keep up with obviously the terminologies and the disruption. You've obviously been advisor on international affairs in the Ministry of Economic Development, and academic coordinator on a master on international relations, Europe, Latin America, professor of both diplomacy and foreign affairs. We really want to look forward to hearing the perspective of Latin America. And as you are in the South, you're even more in the South than Morocco. See, what kind of impact has think tanks such as yours have had in Argentina, and what are the latest trends, and how does a think tank adjust in trying to anticipate and also contribute in some way to the disruptions we see today. And in terms of disruption, I don't think we have a better example today than our next speaker, Mr. Stuart Johnson. You are head of public affairs. You are a professional communication specialist, and you worked a lot with the UK government. So I don't think we can have a better timing to have you elaborate on what is happening in the UK right now. And just to introduce you, you're a high-profile media relation and crisis communication specialist, chartered practitioner, and honorary research fellow of the University of Aberdeen, which is, I believe, in Scotland. So part of the United Kingdom. We will discuss on those issues as well, making sure that the disruption, how far can the disruption go at this stage? And you have been nominated Best Current Affair Influencer in 2020 by Value Online Influence medium. So welcome among us. It's a pleasure to be able to elaborate on what the UK and what the origin of the think tanks, where it originated, how far it has reached, and hopefully where we're heading. Scott Goodstein, welcome back among us. You're founder and CEO of Catalyst Campaigns. I think we've had you on a think tank panel discussion before. You're a great major disruptor. You are actually the one who developed Barack Obama's social media campaign. So you turned a junior senator into a US president. Then you addressed Bernie Sanders, I'd say, coming up on social networks and challenging a major Democratic figure, namely Hillary Clinton. We've seen also the fact that you have been involved in multiple not only nationwide movements in the United States. You're obviously from the United States. You're very active with social causes, and And that is extremely important also to note that the actor of change is not only relevant to politics, but to rights in society, if we want to have a society that is as diverse as possible. And that would be great to have your take on what you have been doing in the United States and how that transposes elsewhere in the world. You've been active in a variety of countries. I mean, to name a few: Brazil, Belarus, Canada, France, Iraq, Israel, Mexico, Uruguay. So you name it. So wherever there is disruption, Scott is not far. So that's a good thing to know. And with that, I have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Ramadan to Abu Jazar. A very well-known figure in the Arab world, the director of the Brussels International Center for Research and Human Rights. You're located in Belgium, originally from Palestine. And you are obviously focusing on a number of projects. You're director of this center, and you are obviously dealing with the election observations and advising several institutions and policy centers on processes and how actually public opinion can be influenced to that extent. You obviously have extended parliamentary and political relations in many parliaments and international forums, and you're an expert in European affairs for many Arab media, that is for sure. And we look forward to see not only the effect of elections, but we're also concerned because of Scott's input that the electorate, once they have the results of election, do not necessarily agree with them. So that's quite a challenge that we're going to address as well in this session. And I'm really happy to be able to introduce Eva Gumnishka from Bulgaria. You are CEO of Humans in the Loop. And we're going to see with Eva's input how artificial intelligence, because that's your field of specialty, has actually provided an additional range of possibilities to the speed of think tanks, and how that actually how artificial intelligence has actually shaped societies as well. So, Scott, you were not alone. There is also AI that plays a role on social networks. And you've obviously been involved in connecting refugees and conflicted affected refugees, conflicted affected people to perform online work, because the name of your institution is Human in the Loop. Something we tend to forget is that artificial intelligence has a human behind to be able to fine-tune the models. And we're going to see how, with the input of different perspectives, we may have an influence on artificial intelligence and how much it shapes our global thinking and the range of possibilities that are now available. We have next to you Milos Zingic, Program Manager and Senior Researcher of the European Policy Center. I see Kingdom of Belgium, but your most extensive work is in Belgrade. You're a Serbian national and a professional policy analyst, and with significant EU integration and public administration policy analysis, which was hopefully very useful to your country that is in a pathway, hopefully, of rejoining. I'm trying to make some statement here on the state of play of Serbia, European Union, and obviously we had a geopolitical discussion on, there's plenty here about Russia's role in that process. You have 10 years of work experience on EU accession processes in the Western Balkans. So that's going to lead me subsequently to introduce our last speaker. But before that, I cannot miss the opportunity to introduce Marius, who was with us this morning from South Africa. You are a director scenario at the World Energy Council. We had an extensive energy security and energy future analysis discussion this morning. You're director of the center of the council. You're obviously also learning and organizational transformational influencer, I would say, in the School of International Futures. So you're a specialist on trying to define what the futures and future prospects are likely to be. We talked about what will happen in energy this morning, and now the idea is really looking at the global global societal impacts and issues as strategic as energy and a variety of other issues in society with and the input of think tanks. Last but not least, we have obviously our last speaker. Mrs. Voodoo, you are the former Justice Minister of Albania. Welcome to Morocco. It's a pleasure to have you. You obviously have tremendous experience also in European parliamentary affairs, where you were very active, and you've also ended up at teaching, amongst others, at Sciences Po. And we've had actually Enrico Letta, who was probably the head of Sciences Po here as a speaker a couple of years ago before becoming Prime Minister of Italy. So you can see now that political science and think tanks and the influence of opinion is a major topic. And what is best to start the topic, now that I have introduced you all, to switch now to go back, and I know you're going to leave us earlier, so I'm going to give you the floor as soon as I can. And I'd like to go back to, of course, obviously the almost compelling situation of the UK, the cradle of think tanks, and you obviously have some, we'd like to have some lessons of what think tanks may have made to your probably one of the oldest democracy, parliamentary democracy, functional one, more or less. What have you learned? What have we learned actually from the think tanks and their impact? Actually, and the list is long. We've got Brexit, we've got COVID management, we've got all the disruptions, governmental heads of states, and also, you know, opinions. We've got, you know, head of state very active in climate change, and we've got all the debate on how the government, successive government, try to manage a new standing. And so the idea is, you know, think tanks, you brainstormed a lot in the UK. What can we take out of that?
Thank you, and thank you for the invite to the panel. Given the number of changes of Prime Minister we've had in the UK this year, the fact that a previous panel speaker has become Prime Minister of Italy, maybe it's my turn in the UK next. And also just very quick apologies. I realise I'm bringing the tone of the panel down by being dressed down. Whilst I'm in Morocco, my case isn't. So unfortunately, but in terms of the issues that we've been facing in the UK, particularly this year, but going back a number of years now, I think politicians and governments in particular have been outsourcing their thinking to think tanks. Instead of working through with party members, instead of talking to the public more, they've just worked with, particularly this government, with several sort of well-placed think tanks. And in that context, we have to remember that those think tanks are in a competitive space. So some are defending their spaces. They have a particular sort of policy agenda, a particular, you know, look upon life that they want to, you know, proceed with. Others try and be more expert in particular areas. I don't know, you know, devolution or foreign affairs or something along those sort of lines. But it is a competitive market for ideas. So the think tanks themselves are looking to carve out a sort of a distinctive appeal, often to their core, either in a policy area or more generally in a political area as well. And that means they can lean into disruption, I think, in a way that has, you know, that we've seen in the UK. But we also, just as a sort of side issue, we also almost have think tanks within political parties as well. We have groups of MPs coming together and effectively being their own think tank as well, which puts a slightly different dynamic on it.
Does it mean they don't trust think tanks? They have to have their own?
I think it's just another set of alternatives. And actually, I think some of those internal think tanks often then work with the external think tanks as well. So it sort of becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling echo chamber, if you like, of policy, which then means that they don't get challenged. So coming back to, you know, the main point about what, you know, where we've been and why we're here in sort of the UK policy setting, is that in effect what the not current Prime Minister, the Prime Minister before that lasted just over a month, half of which was when the Queen was unfortunately died and we were in a state of mourning. So she was in power for a month, but actually only in power for about 2 or 3 weeks. They just implemented an agenda put forward by a think tank, a couple of think tanks, but one main one. So much so that that think tank actually got itself on the news. It became a thing that people were aware of in a way that, you know, most electorates don't know what think tanks are and will have no exposure to them. That particular think tank got news coverage. They've also now found themselves on the receiving end of activist intervention and being, you know, sprayed with paint and other things by environmental activists as well, because of that profile that comes with it. And sorry, just to round this bit off, which is that the internal think tank and the external think tank, the IEA, and then the internal one of the Conservative Party in this instance, meant that because they were reinforcing those views, it meant they went unchallenged. So the government, as they came in, Liz Truss as Prime Minister, then implemented those policies without challenge. There was nobody internally or externally saying, hold on, do you really think this is a good idea? And it went wrong. It went really wrong very quickly.
So talking about things that were wrong, that went wrong, and we don't know where things are going right now. How much do you think Brexit is the result of think tank logic? And has it been challenged really before it hit the famous referendum and the result we got?
I mean, again, you know, there were similar think tanks sort of pushing the Brexit agenda and pushing the idea of Brexit. But, you know, I think, you know, largely Britain voted for Brexit on the basis of bad communications, actually. You know, good campaigning for those that wanted it and bad campaigning by those that wanted to stop it. So, you know, the think tank position and arguments that they were putting forward certainly helped the Brexit debate, the Brexit arguments, but I think fundamentally that campaign was lost because of communications.
So you talk about communications, that's kind of a good lead to, public opinion influencing. It's a good lead for Scott Goodstein's work in terms of catalyzing a political campaign. You've obviously disrupted quite a lot of campaigns and preconceived ideas in the political establishment. I'm not going to list them all. As a result, politics seem to become more polarized and volatile the world over. How do you think, if I can challenge you just with this question to start with, think tanks can identify their audiences, can anticipate their audiences and their changing needs?
I guess the best way that I'd answer that is one of our founding fathers, turns out later in history, not that great, Thomas Jefferson, said something to the effect of, let me paraphrase it, you should not be forced as a man to wear the same coat as a young boy, that everybody's communication strategies need to evolve. And he understood that there needed to be an evolution in America, and this experiment in American democracy needed to constantly evolve. And so our country was based on this concept of evolution in governance, evolution in communication, but yet we somehow in the last 10 to 15 years have gotten stuck in this rut of listen to the think tank, stop listening to yourselves, or listen to the polls and stop actually leading. And then all of a sudden COVID happens. And there was no playbook. There was no 100-page memo sitting around. And I think that the world realizes that we no longer need the 100-page memo. And the slowness of a process, I believe that we shouldn't burn the think tanks to the ground. I don't want to get run out of this panel. But I do think that we should be experimenting with what is a rapid response process? What is a labs process? Is there some type of new process for what the world really needs? And I don't think that, and I'll pick on the US, not the international, because I don't know as much on the international, but in the US, that the think tanks have moved so slow that they're going to move themselves into irrelevancy if they can't figure out how to put out something a little bit faster, a little bit more, before the country evolves past them.
So you got two dimensions here. You got communications, making a concise analysis and message to make sure think tanks can be most effective. There's obviously the impact of technology and AI. We're going to see how that's going to shape the message. But fundamentally speaking, what do you see? What kind of evolution you would see in the immediate future in your country for think tanks in generally, the trend?
Well, I think that mission alignment and purpose needs to be reassessed by just about every think tank. Otherwise, you get into, instead of think tank, you get into what I would call group think. And doing the same old when the entire world is moved and shifted and no one's realized that the world is moved and shifted, of our smartest thought leaders, because they've forgotten what their mission is. And if their mission is to rapidly serve the public, then they should be reassessing and realigning where their funding structure is going and where their communication structure is going.
Last but not least, we are now faced also with the influence of AI, alternative realities, fake news and, absolutely. But I just would like to have your take on basically...
Yeah, I can answer on the fake news.
The role of think tank and fake news.
I mean, each think tank in the U.S. has a different purpose, but I don't think a lot of the think tanks understood that their work and their reports were also going to be subject to how it got messaged and how it got communicated. And so if your think tank is used to putting out a 100-page paper and only having one or two pieces being misinformation coming out of it, then you're doing a disservice to your entire institution. And so I do think that everybody has to think about misinformation and disinformation, not understood facts, and also not understood the rapidness of people scrolling through Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and only paying attention to the little bite size. So good and bad. Yes, make your information bite size, but B, make sure that it's being sourced in a real way. But on AI, I look forward to hearing from a real expert. It's not my discipline.
Okay, I will just before hearing on AI and on the impact of fake news and a variety of other issues on elections and the role of think tank, I'd like to yield the floor to Mrs. Vaudou, and because you have to leave us earlier, and it's a pity, by the way, and what in your view, you've been involved in education and planning mostly for your government and in academia. How do you think tank can get involved in trying to anticipate the challenges that the political lawmaking and adjusting to major disruptive challenges in today's world? What can think tank do? How would you train actually think tankers?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me here, and I do apologize for leaving earlier. It's just that another panel is clashing with this one. So, but indeed, I'm very eager to listen later on about your responses. Being from Albania and leading a think tank which was attached to the Albanian government, you may imagine how this is not necessarily the priority. Actually, being Albania, a poor country, of course, a think tank will never be a priority for the citizens. So first of all, you have to explain to them like why we do exist in the first place. So of course, you have all these workshops, political academies, annually and monthly, and sometimes workshops are related to the actually building and setting up the mechanisms for members of parliament or the government officials. And at the same time, we are research oriented. So basically, the policy papers that think tanks are writing and are publishing and are promoting in events, very often they are not read, let's be realistic. not only from the citizens, but sometimes they are not even read from our colleagues or policymakers. The world is very dynamic.
Is it the 100-page syndrome?
Sometimes it's even 100 pages, but sometimes it's even 10 pages. So this is why there is a necessity, as the previous speaker, Mr. Goodstein, mentioned, it's very necessary to actually understand the dynamic world that we're living in. Most people would scroll on the social media, they would want this very brief information. So as long as we do not understand this and we do not accept this, it will be a struggle actually to survive in such a world which actually is running, and a lot of information is very brief. Being countries, not only Albania, but the Balkan countries, mainly financed by foreign foundations, and I can mention here the Swedish foundation Olaf Palme, or the Finnish one Kalevi Sorsa, Friedrich Stiftung. We have worked with Jean Jaurès and so on. Of course, they would bring another perspective. We had trainers from UK as well, very professional and indeed very useful for our young people who were actually aiming at a political career later on. But of course, still it is very misunderstood, the whole concept and the whole definition of think tanks. And we all know that there is a struggle to actually get funds and how they are used to. So since we are now hopefully in a post-COVID era, I hope so at least, it is very important to actually cut the funds for all the possible meetings that we have organized so far physically, to actually organize them online if there is not necessarily a need for this too. And I do believe that communication is still, the right communication is missing. Maybe communicating through the social media sometimes may be considered a little bit superficial and not very necessary, but indeed, if we do not communicate, let's suppose, for example, with Twitter, all possible key concepts and why we have, for example, to lead the citizens to vote for one candidate and not the other. This is the best example is to actually have more communication officers working on this very summarized information, which may be actually communicated through the social media. So I believe one of the mechanisms today to use and to actually highlight the role of think tanks, which I do believe that is very necessary, is crucial and cannot be replaced by the staff of MPs in the assemblies or the staff in the government, actually should be highlighted more and should be channeled more in the social media.
How about Amadeus' experience with the MEDays? You know, the speed of information, the speed of ideas that are being exchanged, and having essentially a government trying to help, not only organize, host us events. The region of Tanger obviously hosting us with a whole range of sponsors. Don't you think that events and having just raw information being fed into the mainstream media, into YouTube channels, etc. Wouldn't that be a way of promoting at least the debate of what the think tank should be, and what would be the position of Albania in trying, how is it in organizing events and trying to just push for some issues that are, for example, of national, global, regional effect. We obviously deal with a lot. We have a lot on our plate here at Amadeus and MEDays.
Yes, well, Albania has, since it has been before very isolated, so now there is this pendulum which is on the other way around, and actually this year has been the youth capital of Europe, so there have been overwhelmingly a lot of events which were organized. And in Albania, yes, people do believe that it is important to exchange and to have this kind of events. And of course, from all this series of events and all these topics, which may be very interesting, it is a little bit difficult to actually be interested in everything and to memorize everything, and that's not even the point here. I believe that this kind of platforms here, as we are today, all these days, which is organized so beautifully, I believe they help the citizens to actually have another perspective. Because if we look at the profiles of the speakers of this panel or other panels, actually most of them have been serving either in the government or in the private sector. So they would have their own say, not necessarily being politically colored. So this is very important, that they don't necessarily defend the political interest of one specific government.
Absolutely, and there is also another dimension of these events, which is obviously the networking possibilities, the blending of public, private, citizens, government officials, and that's quite an interesting and a very important exercise for, I think, a whole range of countries, not only Albania. And where I'm getting at, and I don't know, how much more time can you devote here, but the idea is to see what kind of regional impact can you have on the Balkans, and I'd like to follow through with Milos afterwards. Do you have a few words to add before we switch to Milos?
Totally, yes, indeed, it is indeed. I'm very glad that our Serbian colleague is here, since he can give another perspective. Actually, all the rest of the countries in the Balkans are speaking a Slavic language, which mostly would understand each other, even though they are distinguished languages. And Albania, of course, is a country with its own history, and language may be a divisive factors in one way. And this is where the think tanks have played this great role. Think tanks like Friedrich Herbert or Olaf Palme and so on, they have been actually financing these workshops, regional workshops, where they would actually put people together. And actually, I have been impressed, especially from the young leaders, young professionals under 30. They would have some stereotypes in their minds, or about the concept of the enemy, the neighbors, and all the wars that the Balkans went through in the 90s. So to actually have, especially the young people in the room, all together, working for several days or even a week in some workshops, have been amazing, and we can already see the results. It's not only EU-driven in the sense that it's not only for the neighborhood policy, which is actually a very specific request from the EU, but it is indeed to bring more prosperity to the region and to leave the past behind, and the conflicts in the 90s behind.
Thank you very much. I was just told that you had to leave the floor, so thank you very much for being with us. Don't forget to get sponsors from Albania, like MEDays is trying to do with Morocco, because it's a bottom-up process as well, and ownership of the forum is really important for, I believe, a country, and for think tanks as well. Thank you very much, Voodoo. It was a pleasure to have you among us. Thank you. And so with that, Milos, we talked about war in the Balkans. So of course, Serbia shows up. No, I know. But I have to be provocative. You have to give me. So I basically refer to that because we had on a previous online panel, we had your former Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was Jeremy.
Mr. Vukermic, maybe.
Exactly. And he was instrumental. I think he spent for 1 year more time on the air than on the ground, trying to promote the reintegration of Serbia in the global...
And he has a think tank, by the way.
There we go. So now we understand why he was so active in networking, and I really appreciate the discussion we had. I think it's available online, and he was actually even a candidate for Secretary General of the United Nations, and Gutierrez has won the contest. So it's just to show you basically the range of possibilities when you have a think tank, how you can take a situation where you're isolated. We had the case of Albania, perhaps to some extent Serbia, and how you can really push through issues that are very sensitive for both your country and the direct neighbors, obviously. I'm sorry to have brought this on the forefront. It's just...
It's okay. Luckily, Serbia have gone out of isolation for quite some time already. But what we heard from Stuart and from Ms. Voodoo and from Scott is something that I want to follow up to, because essentially shows what's the situation on our think tank market. So in the advent... Yeah?
Can you get the mic closer
Yeah,
so we hear you
in the advent
better?
of think tanks, so politicians and a policymaker were outsourcing them to provide them with the policy advice. In Serbia and our region, politicians don't need think tanks. It was a realization, and not in a sense of some sort of epiphany, but realization from people who are working in the administration that there is no enough evidence in data to inform the policy decisions. So we kind of turn it upside down, you know. So we are chasing after politicians to provide them with evidence for the benefit of society. And this is the reality with the new generation of think tanks that have emerged after the 2000, this democratic transition. So it's a totally different story. As Ms. Fudu said, we are competing in the situation of the scarce resources, financial ones.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, among other things, of course. And we don't have institutional membership. We don't have essentially a constituency. So you have to be project-based to survive. And one part of your job, except for providing policy advice to the policymakers, is to constantly fund yourself. So fundraising at the same time, meaning that the project management is also something you have to do on a daily basis all year round. In such circumstances, what we in the European Policy Center from Belgrade did, and I'm not saying this necessarily as a good example or anything, I'm not indulging in self-love, but just to show you how we try to approach things, is to network within the Western Balkans. So we have a network of think tanks, which is, although informal, meaning not legal entity, we act together, we fundraise together, we implement research projects together. And this is also why we have, so to say, we have to influence decision-making that happens in different places. So it's not only authorities in Serbia or Albania or in North Macedonia or in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also in Brussels, because we are all on the same path to the EU, other regional and international organizations that also affect decisions that affect our society. So, and this is especially important speaking about the 4.0 age of disruptions, being innovative, being technologically advanced or creative as a think tank. So innovation is expensive, and not everyone has the capacity for that. So when you innovate, it means basically that you have to try. If you're trying, it means that you're making a mistakes, because you're trying, there's a trial and error, of course, and by being together as a network in the Balkans, we can learn from each other and borrow from each other, because frankly speaking, not everyone has the capacity to innovate and be disruptive in the context that I have just briefly described.
Thank you very much, Milos. That was quite inspiring. And since you talk about disruption and innovation, I mean, you know, I'd like to engage a little bit the role of social networks, what's behind, you know, perhaps a man behind the loop, or, you know, human behind the loop per se. And your action to make sure that you can then introduce refugees, minorities to express and try to adjust those algorithms that are at the origin of influencing and disrupting politically huge countries, institutions, I mean the world over. The floor is yours, please.
Yes, absolutely. So just to, in relation to what my colleagues have already spoken about the Balkans, I think it's great that we have quite a lot of representation of the Eastern and Central Europe here. I think the region is really an example of, let's say, an area that didn't have a think tank tradition and that has now started adopting think tanks. And there is actually a big risk here because think tanks are being perceived by local populations as something foreign. Recently in Bulgaria, there has been an act for foreign agents that has been produced by a far-right party in order to flag all organizations that are receiving funding from abroad. And of course, a lot of think tanks are actually receiving funding, as they mentioned, from Northern, Western Europe, and so on. And there is a certain kind of animosity or resistance that can be felt in the local society. And of course, it's normal because with think tanks, with the model, comes also the, let's say, ideological tendency. And frequently, other ideologies and mindsets that are not regularly present, let's say, in the West, are completely excluded from this type of tradition or the think tank model itself. I'm not sure, maybe Mr. Ramadan can share whether there are any Islamic think tanks or, alternative think tanks with different types of viewpoints. So that is something that for me personally is quite an interesting, before, we move even to AI, just this kind of a regional perspective on the role of think tanks. And of course, the biggest issue is, are they just lobbying organizations that are, shaped under the guise of think tanks? And who's funding them? Why are they funding them? What's the agenda behind the funding, and so on? So that's definitely, a concern locally that we have. In terms of AI, I would say AI, when people think about it, they imagine, the Terminator or a lot of, other like autonomous robots and machines and so on, but very frequently it's just statistics on steroids. And in a lot of cases that are related to, let's say, predictive AI systems or recommendation engines, there it's a question of what is the optimal output that we're seeking. And of course, in the case of social media, they're seeking engagement and clicks and shares and comments and people engaging with, different types of divisive content. So I would say the problem is not in AI. The problem is in what is the goal that we have for those AI systems that we're trying to optimize for. So yeah, that's my input.
And not only what are the roles, what are the forces behind, because in the end, there's also strong business case for social mediums and influence wielding over major issue the world over. Ramadan Abu Jazar, the floor is yours. I think you have a lead there to talk about Islamic, Arab think tanks. How independent can they be? What can they address in terms of issues? And the influence of think tanks in the Arab world. How do you see it emerging? And how do you see it influencing politics and some, key issues? And we're going to go obviously to South Africa and Argentina afterwards to have a broader picture as well. Thank you very much. So just talk. Yeah, it's going to come. Yeah. Keep talking. Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, MEDays. I would like to speak in Arabic. I'm so sorry for... Okay. مراكز الأبحاث أو بالعربية مراكز التفكير هي مراكز تخلق سيناريوهات وتقوم بوضعها أمام العامة، أمام الجماهير، ومن ثم صناع القرار يقيسون ردود الفعل فيأخذون ما يريدون، ثم يتم اعتماد هذا كعامل مساعد لصناعة القرار. في الدول العربية والإسلامية لم يكن يوجد في الماضي مراكز بحث أو مراكز تفكير لتساعد المجتمعات والحكومات. مؤخرا بدأنا نلحظ وجود مراكز أبحاث وأصبح لديها تأثير، ولكن التأثير حسب إرادة الحكومات أو حسب إرادة صانع القرار. إذا كان مركز الأبحاث يقدم مادة يمكن أن تكون في صالح المجتمع يتبناها صانع القرار، ولكن على عكس ما هو موجود في الولايات المتحدة أو في دول الاتحاد الأوروبي، دول الغربية. مراكز الأبحاث لها هامش كبير من الحريات، ولكنها لا تتمتع بديمقراطية كاملة. معظم مراكز الأبحاث نشعر أنها موجهة، أنا أتحدث هنا على الغرب، موجهة مثلا في الولايات المتحدة، إما إذا تحدثنا في السياسة فقط، إما لصالح الديمقراطيين أو الجمهوريين. وشهدنا جدلا كبيرا في الولايات المتحدة، الديمقراطية الأولى في العالم، عندما رفض ترامب الاعتراف بنتائج الانتخابات الأخيرة واعتبرها سرقت ومزورة. هناك مراكز أبحاث وصحافة تحدثت عن رأي ترامب، والعكس صحيح. في الدول الغربية أو في الدول الأوروبية هناك إرث عريق لدى المملكة المتحدة بريطانيا في التعامل مع توجيه الرأي العام من خلال مراكز الأبحاث. بريطانيا تمارس الانتخابات منذ 300 سنة، أصبح للشعب البريطاني خبرة كبيرة في التعامل مع صندوق الانتخاب، ولكن من خلال عمل مراكز أبحاث دائما توجه الشعب البريطاني إلى التعامل الجيد. أي يمكن القول أن مراكز الأبحاث هي التي تصنع في الدول المتقدمة والمتحضرة والديمقراطية، هي التي تصنع شكل المستقبل السياسي. العودة لسؤال محمد، في الدول العربية والإسلامية، في الدول الإسلامية لا أعتقد أن إيران لديها ديمقراطية، لأن في إيران لا يوجد شيء اسمه مراكز أبحاث، يوجد إملاءات من المرشد الذي يأخذ مكانة ألوهية، بحيث أنه هناك انتخابات ولكن هناك تحديد للأسماء التي يمكن أن ترشح نفسها، يتم رفض أسماء وتحديد أسماء. إذن لا يوجد ديمقراطية أو ديمقراطية عرجاء. مراكز الأبحاث الإيرانية كثيرة، ولكنها تعمل لصالح تسويق سياسة المرشد وليس لعملية تنوير إلى الشعب الإيراني. في الدول العربية والإسلامية وخاصة في دول الخليج مؤخرا، ونتحدث منذ 20 سنة، بدأ يوجد مراكز أبحاث تستفيد من خبرات أجنبية كثيرة، من خبراء من الولايات المتحدة، من الأرجنتين، من جنوب أفريقيا، من الدول الأوروبية ومن المغرب العربي. المغرب العربي بالنسبة للدول العربية والدول الإسلامية متقدم كثيرا في هذا المجال. توجد هناك تجارب نظرا لاحتكاك المغرب العربي بأوروبا، نظرا للخبرات العلمية المغربية القادمة من أوروبا، أي يتعلمون في الجامعات الأوروبية فيعودون بالتجارب، ونظرا لأن المجتمع المغاربي مؤهل لتقبل فكرة التغيير من خلال السيناريوهات التي تطرحها مراكز الأبحاث. إذن مراكز الأبحاث هي عامل مهم لتنوير الشعوب إذا تم إحسان أو تم التعامل معها بشكل جيد مع مخرجاتها. أشكرك، وأنا أطلت يا محمد، طولت عليك.
شكرا جزيلا. If I may just follow up on that, you mentioned obviously Iran, you mentioned the Maghreb. How about the Near East, regarding, for example, Palestinian-Israeli peace processes and think tanks? What's the activity that what you can describe, and where are we heading in terms of thought process and issues that could be raised?
هناك أشكرك. هناك في إسرائيل هناك فهم خاطئ كبير جدا للديمقراطية. إسرائيل معروفة كأنها الديمقراطية رقم 1 في الشرق الأوسط، ولكن الأحزاب المتطرفة في إسرائيل والمتدينين أخرجوا هذه الديمقراطية من مكانها الصحيح ووضعوها في مجال التعصب والتطرف. وما شاهدناه من تساوي أصوات بين طرفين في الانتخابات الإسرائيلية، حيث تساوت الأصوات بنسبة 50%، ولكن أصحاب الفكر المتطرف والذين لا يؤمنون بالسلام هم الذين فازوا في الانتخابات الإسرائيلية للأسف. لا يوجد طرف حقيقي من الطرف الإسرائيلي لعملية السلام. الفلسطينيين لديهم تجربة سيئة في انتخابات كاذبة نجحت فيها حماس، لأن تم تزوير الانتخابات خارج الصندوق، عندما قام رجال الدين في المساجد يقولون للشعب أن من ينتخب حماس يدخل الجنة. هنا التزوير الكاذب. لذلك لدينا متطرفين في الطرف الفلسطيني، ولدينا الأكثر تطرفا في الطرف الإسرائيلي. عملية السلام تحتاج إلى عقلاء، تحتاج إلى حكماء، تحتاج إلى تغيير. هناك دول عربية قفزت قفزة كبيرة جدا تجاه السلام عندما قامت بالتوقيع مع إسرائيل، ولكن بقرب وبتحليلنا لهذه التوجهات السياسية نعتقد أن كل الدول العربية سواء مصر، الأردن قبل في الماضي، والإمارات والبحرين والمغرب عندما قاموا بتوقيع مع إسرائيل لدفع عملية السلام للأمام، وليس لاستخدام حكومة متطرفة جدا. ثلث من يشكل الحكومة هو يتبع حزب بن غفير الذي ينادي بخطاب متطرف ضد العرب وضد المسلمين وضد أي شيء غير يهودي، وهو يمارس العنصرية حتى ضد مواطنين إسرائيليين سواء يهود أو غير يهود. أعتقد أن الانتخابات ليست دائما تأتي بنتائج تخدم الأمن والسلم والسلام في العالم. لذلك مراكز الأبحاث يجب أن تعمل مجددا على إيجاد آليات لحجب المتطرفين عن فرصة تلويث المجتمع وتلويث فكر المجتمع.
شكرا جزيلا. And it also highlights the fact that think tanks are needed everywhere and for all parties. It could be also extreme parties that need to rethink their logic, and we've seen obviously because of social networks, because of the expectation of everybody, we're heading towards extremes, we're leveraging extremes. We see populist elections the world over, Europe, Brazil, and the whole mess. And since I did mention Brazil, I think I'm not too far from Argentina, and we're kind of eager to see how the electoral mess that your neighboring country is, I don't know whether he's entering or he's going out of, will affect the whole logic of democratic debates and the role of the think tanks in your continent.
Thank you. I was listening very carefully to my colleagues. I was thinking that our discussion goes but through another channel, for our think tanks in Argentina and Latin America. Let me tell you that the technology is always a challenge for us, for Argentina and from Latin America. And we had other issues that have to, I don't remember, have to, how do you say in English? Fundraising, sorry. So that is very important for us, and I forgot that. But it's an issue that everyday issue. Fundraising for us, and independence is very important. Let me tell you that in Argentina, the think tanks are independent. But I was listening very carefully to my colleagues, as I said before, and for us...
Excuse me, are they privately sponsored?
Sorry?
Privately or institutionally sponsored?
No, they are privately. Our case is a private. It's a very traditional think tank, 42 years old. And so, but I was thinking that the discussion for us is first cultural. I am not an expert in technology, but I am a managing director of CARI, Argentine Council for International Relations. I was many years trying to introduce technology, and especially virtuality, in my institution. And here there is a colleague, a young colleague that she's part of CARI, so she knows that I was fighting a lot because our institution, there is a lot of diplomats, traditional. Yeah. So, and they were habituated to work personally and discuss very secret things in a very secret meetings. And the thing is that I was trying many years to introduce the technology, but doesn't happen before pandemic, because the pandemic has accelerated irreversible change processes, especially new technologies. That was the reason that now we used to start to use virtuality. The members of our institution, I think it happened with other institutions in Argentina, in Latin America, they know the benefits of the virtuality. And now we have another problem, that the problem is to try to get back these people to the floor, to our institution.
But that's the networking, you cannot network virtually. You do have also an added value in having events and networking. I just have a quick question, if I may, on, if you have, this is also privately sponsored. Amadeus Institut took some independence by having a donor, a major donor, trying to fund the activity of the think tank. So I'm not going to, it's, you have some donors that have national,
yes,
that look at broader pictures. How does it work in Argentina with the private donors?
First, let me tell you that technology for us is very expensive. It's very difficult. It's very hard to work with this. But the sponsorship in Argentina for think tanks is very difficult as well, because people don't understand the role, the important role that think tank has in a democracy. So it's very important. So, for example, we are, before pandemic and during pandemic, after pandemic, we are losing every day sponsors. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to get a sponsor for Argentine think tanks and things for Latin America. So we live in another reality. So that's I said that I was thinking about this. Wow, but our discussion goes, but it's in another level. No, we are trying to survive. We're trying to get sponsors. We're trying to try to convince the benefits of virtuality. And so,
do you have any major issue that can raise the interest of sponsors? That
no,
that's also
because, for example, in my case, when I have meetings with companies, they ask me about the value of the mark, of the brand value of so. There is not a brand value. It's that we are a good tool, for democracy. Where we represent you. It's very hard to. And so now technology is important for us, but it's not our main issue.
Okay. Just in terms of
Sorry
brand,
about this,
no problem. In terms of branding, I've had events with MEDays promoting the brand Morocco. So you have an export agency of Morocco that say, okay, try to do some branding and to, tackle what can we do for the image of Morocco, and we sponsor you to see what the think tank can bring to added value to a brand of a country. Is that similar approach developed in Argentina, for example, or for your center, for example? It's a commercial one. It's a commercial branding of a country.
Yes, but we have always had a discussion in our institution that is we are an independent institution, so it's difficult to be an independent. So
but you do have institutional sponsors as well.
Yes.
So
yes.
You cannot say I'm independent, but I receive money from
I know,
government.
I like to be in my position.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Because it's very hard. That's the reason. No, we used to have a support of our government, very, very small.
Okay.
And that is very hard. But the thing is that depends on the government. Depends on we have or not the support.
Okay, so basically your government is not concerned about what is happening in your neighboring country and doesn't want to have an analysis of what's ahead on perhaps Brazil-Argentinian relationships and so forth. Those are strategic foresights. How, is there anything that can raise the interest of a think tank in a commercial basis?
Yes, that maybe
commercial think tank basis.
Always a commercial. Producing
ideas.
Politics and foreign affairs is not. It's it's hard to say this, but it's not this is not an issue of interest for the companies. Maybe
Okay.
here in some places it's hard to understand this, but this is our. She said yes because she's in our, but she's part of our institution, but she is a member or a leader of another think tank, Argentine think tank. So it's always difficult when you try to, in our case, foreign affairs. Companies don't understand that about globalization, about that.
Okay, because we got foreign affairs here in
That's
Morocco.
the reason we are Latin America, so,
Foreign affairs here in Morocco, and I'm going to turn to the floor soon. Asks a private renewable energy entrepreneur to discuss about the issues on a variety of think tanks, and the idea of think tanks is that you can mobilize all kinds of competences in a debate. And the more competence, the more diversity you have in debates, the more useful it can be for the think tank, which, by the way, does not even need to pay for such resources. So that's also a big advantage. You're producing idea, you're brainstorming. So in exchange, you get exposure, but you don't pay for that. So obviously, that's also some models that could be applied in Argentina. Let me just switch to South Africa.
Let me tell you only 1 second. I forgot to say to you that our main support are people, our members.
Okay. So we have also think tanks that work that way as well. They're funded by members. Yeah, okay. That's
people,
another.
persons,
yeah.
not institutions,
I
not
understand.
companies.
I understand. I thought it was institution and commercial. We have think tanks that work that way. Jawel Kertoudi, by the way, is funded by his members. So we have similar financing models. And the idea is to look at a variety of economic models that could apply to think tanks. Okay.
At the moment.
All right.
We see.
Great. Thank you very much. With that, I'd like to yield the floor to Dr. Utwison for two things, the disruptive, the futures analysis, and if you could shed some light on what is happening perhaps in South Africa in terms of idea generation, think tank activity, and the trends that we may see in South Africa, which may influence, we're a forum of the South, you're obviously in the South. How can we gain from what is happening in your country?
Well, thank you for the question, and it's been fascinating listening to all the colleagues. I think that the first thing to say is that when we're discussing think tanks, it might not be helpful to think of them in a very narrow sense as formal think tank institutions, because actually what we're talking about is something much more fundamental, which is the public discourse. And so in societies where think tanks are healthy and functional and have not been captured by interests, they can serve a very important purpose of enriching the public discourse. And so in the case of South Africa, where we were under the apartheid regime, think tanks and similar organizations of civil society played a very important role in opposing the apartheid regime. And so I think this is a very important point to recognize, that what think tanks can provide society is an alternative to the public sector, the government, and an alternative to the private sector or business. It can provide a mechanism for the people in that country to express themselves. And in many countries in the global south, where you have very high birth rates, very large youth cohorts, the question is, how do the youth that are not empowered in the political establishment and they are not invested in the private sector very often, how do they express their political views and their political opinions? And so the ability to bring society together, to convene them for dialogue, for reflection, is, I think, the key strategic role of think tanks at a societal level. In South Africa, in particular, where we've got a history of conflict and a history of racial segregation, we find there's an additional role for think tanks, which is about building trust and building mutual understanding. I've just returned from the US, where I'm traveling for a couple of weeks, and if you listen to the polarization in the discourse, there's a role to play by civil society in bringing people together that don't like each other, they don't agree with each other, but they have to find a way to live together, and that requires trust, and that trust requires mutual understanding. And so think tanks have that ability to bring people together and to essentially create the space and to enable the voices of different societal members to dialogue with each other. Now, this raises some of the risks that have been mentioned. One of them is that what is happening in our societies is that these kinds of institutions are being hijacked or being co-opted by narrow interests. And it's a tragedy that in the UK, not only inside of the UK, but through bad actors like Bell Pottinger in the UK, even South Africa's democracy was being manipulated. And so that is a risk to think tanks. But then there's a risk associated with the technology where for public discourse to be effective, that discourse has to be deep and it has to be rigorous. And what the technology is enabling is very rapid, very shallow discourse. And so you can
controversial
say
to the extent possible. So that
you can say something I don't like, and I can hate you or I can like you without really thinking about what it is that you're saying. And so I think when we talk about think tanks 4.0, the real challenge is how do we create think tanks that use technology but enable the depth of engagement that it's going to require to really have a quality conversation in that space that we create.
Thank you very much, Marius. This is really a critical issue. I mean, we've seen also how think tanks enable the youth to participate in the public discourse. You noticed around you, among the 5,000 or 6,000 participants, the age distribution, and so it's a real pleasure to have youth coming along and listening to the debates on global issues, local issues, regional issues, and the collaboration between the global south and all the continents. I think we have reached the time where I have to yield the floor to the audience for any question. And please, if anybody is interested in asking a question, it's going to be interactive between the panel and you and amongst us panelists. Is there any particular issue that you would like to raise? So I have the first in the front row, Andreas, and next it will be you. Sorry.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much for this panel. Great stuff. Mine is not so much a question. I could dress it up as a question, but I'd rather put it as a challenge, and that is, irrespective of the funding models, irrespective of the political culture, the formal political system, whether it's a democracy or an autocracy or whatever else, one of the things that no government can live without and survive without is having people contest the ideas that the government policies are based on. It's not just the ideas, but it's also the data, it is the assumptions, it's the models, and it is the way in which the understanding of the underlying problem is translated into desirable futures and into the measures that need to be put in place. That is, unless there is contestation of whatever kind, there will be errors. You can say that Putin's mistake of invading Ukraine again was a result of him being isolated and having nobody around him who had the courage to actually contradict him and challenge the assumption on which his decisions were made. If that is true, and I believe it's true, then think tanks have a noble function wherever they are in the globe to contest the policy ideas. And I think it needs to be understood that whoever suppresses dissent and contestation, friendly opposition, if you like, is bound to fail. And there's a warning in there for Xi Jinping.
Absolutely. And if I may just rebound on it, I think even for a political system, I don't think think tanks can be as threatful as a more popular form of contestation of the way affairs are being handled. So it's kind of a passive ally also, but a very useful source of information. I don't know if any of you would like to respond to Andreas' comments before we take the next question. Please, Stuart.
Yeah, it's just... Sorry. It's just a thought on that, which is that both in the question and as we've been going around the panel as well, it's sort of different types of think tanks, and a lot of engagement that takes place with think tanks and through think tanks is often not. Some do work with the general public more in terms of education, and they work more with communities. But there are an awful lot that pick a policy area and say, right, we are going to do about, I don't know, government structure, something like that. And then they might work with think tanks to bring them along. So in other words, it's companies that work with think tanks, so it's more of a commercial element. Now, in effect, and I work with think tanks all the time, it's lobbying. I mean, that's what it is. It's lobbying. So we've got that sort of more commercial sort of element, if you like, and then we've got the ones that can work with communities and bring them along. Now, you know, you'll have all sorts, and there'll be different types in different countries, but I think that realisation that there are different sorts of organisations, and I think the important part, if you are going to go down, or you do have a sort of think tank sector which is more involved in lobbying, if you want to use that word, it's about transparency. So where is that money coming? So where a think tank takes the money, who pays for it? And I'm sure there were examples in the States, but certainly examples in the UK, where there isn't that transparency. So we don't know what companies are paying for that piece of research when it's released.
Should it be made public?
I think so. I don't think that's uncontroversial.
Yeah, maybe that can be a recommendation for the organizers as well, to make public the generous funders of this event and of the Amadeus Institute as well. That's going to give all of us as participants more visibility, because, for example, maybe that is information that is publicly available, but I'm not sure. But
it is available on the back of the program. You have the sponsors and the companies.
Perfect.
But
so
there may be others that we don't know, so that's a good point.
Yeah, maybe this is like one insight that our panel can provide.
Please, yeah, Mr. Martinez.
I'd like to say that the main discussion among the think tanks, sorry, okay? Eyes? Okay. No, very briefly. The main discussion among think tanks now is if we are think tanks, independent think tanks, or we are consultants, no? We are a lobby consultant. That is the main point, because if you are a consultant, you can get money easier than if you are independent. That is our case. In my case, for example, I have not a salary. I have 3 jobs, but I do this because I like it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we know that obviously think tanks...
Because I think it's very important, no? The role of the think tanks in democracy.
You know, that's also the beauty of think tanks, is that you need very limited means to be able to operate as a think tank, because you rely on a goodwill, just like you, just like mine, of people that are passionate about exchanging ideas. Yes. So thank you for that. Marius, you wanted to add something to it before Scott, I believe, has something to add as well.
Just one thought on this issue of the independence of think tanks. I think there's a more fundamental point, which is the independence of thinking. That you can have think tanks that are supposedly independent, but there's a dynamic of groupthink, which has been mentioned, or you can have think tanks that are clearly funded by a particular set of interests, but have individuals who work in them who are encouraged to think independently and to have critical thought. And I think that at a societal level, many of the societies we've mentioned are in a process of transition from more autocratic styles of societal organization to more democratic styles. And in the process of that democratization, as we are seeing in South Africa, it's really the quality of the citizen thinking that will determine the outcome of that democracy. I think the point that needs to be made is that before you can have freedom in the democratic sense, you have to have what I think Jefferson referred to as the freedom of thought and conscience. And so that inherent capability of the individual to think for themselves, to apply their mind and do so rationally, and then to enter a rational debate with their democratic opponent. And so that becomes a societal capability, and needs to, I think think tanks can play a role in encouraging that as a culture in society.
Which you can see with the participation age of participants here. I'm sure that in a few years we'll have hopefully an impact on the thought process. What is also interesting, you also mentioned the importance of education, you know, making sure that you're trained in as much adverse thinking, adverse ideas. What is also interesting in what you've raised is also, it's a corporate model. Big US corporations have traditionally had structure within themselves to assess their auto-obsolescence of their business models. It happened with IBM, the Bell companies, and then they are a Rand company. You're just trying to show that you've got it completely wrong, and you're paid to make sure they can challenge the overwhelming model. So it's also, commercially speaking, a very practical way of challenging mainstream ideas. Scott?
Yeah, real quick, there's the good old phrase of if a tree falls in the woods. And I think that what all of these different size and styles of think tanks need to think about is something that the gentleman from South Africa said is if you're involved in the public discourse, doesn't matter who you're paid for, how big or how small you are, if you're not communicating your message to the vast public, so many think tanks exist in the U.S. and they just get glossed over. So we have abundancies where some countries have very little think tanks, but yet the same problem is that the audience of the original think tanks was focused on very, very focused government agency or administration or president, and you're writing this thought-out paper. It's not that that's changed. There is so many other ways for your paper to have a little bit of artistic. One of the most impressive think tanks that we all know is an organization that put out whether you like it or not, the Doomsday Clock. Worldwide, it's an art project of whether it's 7 minutes to midnight or not. But it made everybody think and have a conversation. The other example I'll give is the gentleman to my left is right, that Israel has all these interesting think tanks, but they're all lobbying on their own side versus putting out this information to the world. I worked for one in Israel called Commanders for Israel Security that said that the way to peace by security officials and former security officials is a port in Gaza. Put that out there to the rest of the world to know. Don't just give that to politicians. Let people know that you're speaking up on these issues in a very real way, and that there might be some new ideas in the table instead of having it bound up into a little tiny report that nobody saw. So again, if a tree falls in the woods and your think tank report isn't read by anybody, it's a major problem. So communication, social networks, outreach. I mentioned social networks because the internet is like the cheapest way to broadcast an idea, and that's all. It doesn't require much. Please, Mr. Abu Jazar.
نعم. أنا فهمت السؤال جيدا، بس أنا أعتقد الآن ليس المهم كيف يتم تمويل هذه مراكز الأبحاث، سواء تمويل حكومي أو شركات أو أفراد. أعتقد أن الأهم هو المنتج، ماذا تقدم مراكز الأبحاث هذه. يجب أن نحاسب مراكز الأبحاث كمجتمع مدني أو مؤسسات دولية على ما تقدمه للمجتمع. هناك في الولايات المتحدة وفي أوروبا عندنا ضغط كبير على مصادر التمويل، يحاسبون على سنت من أين ذهب وأين أتى. وأعتقد أن البيروقراطية هذه أدت إلى إغلاق عشرات مراكز الأبحاث الجيدة والتي قدمت في الماضي مواد جيدة جدا. يجب من وجهة نظري شخصية أعتقد أن الأفضل أن نحاسب على ما تقدمه مراكز الأبحاث بغض النظر عن كان تمويلها حكومي أو غير حكومي. أنا لا أشرعن، هناك شركات علاقات عامة هي شركات ربحية تقوم.
Well, how are you going to take somebody accountable for ideas? I mean, the funding sources, we discussed this issue earlier, and we said, they have to be made public. So that I don't think there is even a debate on this topic. And I think we also have a time constraint here. We have another question, and we have others, and we are in a Q&A session. Thank you very much, Mr. Abu Jazar. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks to all the panelists. Excellent comments. So my name is Ekenem Isiche. I work as a director with the Corporate Council in Africa, and I'm also a partner at an advisory firm doing work in about 7 African countries. I say that in the context of when we look at think tanks, what I'm thinking about, and this is a question to everyone, is what really constitutes what we call a think tank? And then, then a part B to that is, how do you separate between a think tank, a consulting firm, a lobbying organization, and, I wrote this down, and an activism group? And the third one is, part C to that is, how do you actually measure these results? Like we talk about people are saying this, saying that, it's out in the press, but how do you actually measure these real results? Over.
Great 3 questions for the second one. That's almost all of the above and kind of a mix, because I don't think tanks can essentially assess exactly what the effect of their ideas are and even the genesis process of these ideas. It's really, it's a brainstorm context that think tanks like to be involved with. Milos, please. Yeah, keep talking, and I think the mic will be activated.
I will not presume to have all the answers that you,
okay.
For the questions that you asked. One can think of that the consultancies are maybe not primarily, but among first things, revenue-driven in a way. So we heard here that the think tanks can also be, let's say, voluntary work. It's something close to your heart that you like. Although my think tank, for example, employs 30 people. So. We have to secure funds. However, I like that you mentioned consultants and firms, because I do think that this is one of the areas where we can be a bit more disruptive, so to say, in the future, to start building alliances of the unlikely, let's say, with the consultancies, because it can be an additional source of funding for a think tank. It can diversify your funds, it can build your portfolio, provide you with future job opportunities, and also make you a connection. So one thing that we try to do, at least partly, to secure all of this, is to apply together with the firms in a big consortium as a junior partner, doing our work for some time within their projects. Of course, there are pros and cons to that. I mentioned the pros, and the cons are that you have to, let's say, compromise your independence that we spoke about a bit, in the sense that your policy advice can get filtered out a bit due to the position of the consultant and the client. And at the same time, the topics that you are going to deal with are being defined more top-down, once again. But still, there is an area of opportunity, at least in Europe, that I see, that can be explored carefully without too much compromising, but still we can sometimes be on the same boat, I think, and this boat can sail.
And it's also a capital, when somebody comes up with a top-down idea, it generates bottom-up reactions and say, oh, how about, because think tanks are also free. That's also one of the biggest assets of a think tank, to say, okay, this could be turned around, and this could provide us with the opportunity to look at things differently. Scott?
I was just going to quickly say, Milos just did the greatest pitch for me and Stuart, so thank you on behalf of consultants. But I would say the only other piece that you missed is look at who your consultants work for and who your consultants' Rolodex is. I do these things similar to the gentleman from Argentina, where it's because you believe in them. And so there are consultants that are hired rogue and will work for anything, and then there's consultants that have built up expertise because they're true believers.
Thank you, Scott. Obviously, I just for the update, I don't think Rolodex are used anymore. So, for contacts, please.
Quick rebound. Yeah, one sentence. In my personal, strong personal opinion, and I truly believe this. All people on this panel believe in this. Think tanks are value-based organization. So you have to know who you are working with. And this is one of the important things. And after this realization, you embark on your journey. And you choose your path nowadays.
Great. Marius.
Thank you. Just want to add one thought to that. So, in the setting up of the think tank that I'm involved in South Africa, we had this debate about, are we going to be an activist organization or a think tank, or are we consulting? And the way we resolved it is by creating a very simple 2x2 on a page, which had the question, are we in a combative relationship with the audience, or are we in a supportive relationship? Are we trying to further their interests, or are we trying to upend their interests? And so what came from that analysis was that we were in a situation where we were actually trying to support the audience But because we had a difference of opinion with them, we were willing to take an activist position at that time. And so it might be the case, especially in a democracy, where a think tank in a period of time, we see this now in energy, some think tanks are having to take an activist position for or against certain types of energy, but there might be other times where that fight has been fought and there's alignment on the values and the principles, and then you take a more supportive role, and you may very well fulfill the role of a consultant. But of course, that raises the risks of becoming invested and co-opted by that set of interests.
So we can see that even think tanks get polarized, and that's, I think, the effect of the diversity of ideas that are floating out there. I don't know whether we have any questions, any further questions from the floor. We have a few minutes left. I'm going to try and tease you a little more. And if not, Stuart.
It's all right. Too many similar names. I think just to reiterate that point, I think independence as well comes into the think tanks. When I'm thinking from what I do, working often with businesses and engaging with government, you will look for a think tank that certainly is expert in that particular area, that maybe government listens to, that is close to. But at the same time, and I think this is the difference between the consultancy part and the think tank part, is you can't buy them. You can't buy that sort of reputation and name and those sort of things without realising that actually that piece of work that they do for you is their piece of work. And the better think tanks are the ones that push back. So yes, there will be collaboration as the piece of work is developed, as the drafts come forward, etc. But at the end of the day, it's their piece of work. And they, as a think tank, sorry, I keep pointing things out, are perfectly entitled to walk away from that if they feel their independence is in any way being curtailed or damaged. So their reputation as well.
Not only that, but think tanks, their main asset is a diversity of point of views over certain issues. So the idea is that you're essentially throwing a problem to an institution that tries to bring in a whole lot of diverse approaches to a problem. And I think just by nature, think tank, brainstorming issues, etc., provides essentially not only the key asset for that institution to build upon, but also its reputation, and that's the beauty of think tank, is that essentially the product, the output is essentially ideas, and ideas, are very broad, and imagination. I think it was Napoleon who said the imagination rules the world. So I think that can be a conclusion of what think tanks can do, at least in terms of ideas. I don't think any think tank has imperial ambitions thus far. We haven't seen that in the debate yet. And I'm going to try and wrap up in a few minutes that are left what we've been covering. We obviously looked at the role of think tanks, and when exposed to the speed of information, we did mention examples of the US, the UK, that have influenced with the help of social networks and technology, the global thought process and the speed at which ideas can influence the public, the consequences on democracies, electoral processes. We looked at various different operating modus of think tanks in different regions. We looked at the Balkans, we looked at South Africa, Argentina, the Middle East, the Arab world, the Middle East peace process as well. So I think we covered quite a range of different approaches and elements that could enable think tanks to bring in great ideas on the table. I mean, one of the greatest ideas, I think, if you look at the MEDays, and I'm coming from the energy sector, was just throwing the idea of a Nigeria-Morocco pipeline. About 8 years ago, people thought, what kind of, where does this idea comes from? And then we see how, because of the unfolding events, this idea becomes more and more interesting to look at, and with an investment and feasibility study being done. So you can see that thanks to the variety of ideas, thanks to the networking of a variety of profiles, we can address and bring in a whole bunch of ideas. They will not all be relevant, but at some point, a few of them can make a big difference in the way the world is trying to get out of its current stalemates. We've looked at the challenge. The most significant challenge, I believe, is a little bit the interaction with artificial intelligence and social networks and the way we interconnect with something we don't really know, how it affects us, in fact, because it tends to propel ideas much faster than we have the capacity to anticipate. So that's a great challenge for think tank to think about. What kind of dangers are we facing with the speed of ideas and their radicalism, and obviously we also covered to some extent how a social network operate. The more radical idea gets the more traction, because in the end that's all attention is very short, and social network owners know how to leverage that to the expense of the sound thought process, and the interest of society. And I think with that, I'd like you to have a round of applause for our outstanding panelists dealing with a complex issue, I must admit. And I thank you very much for being among us, and I look forward to, perhaps address Think Tank 5.0, 6.0, we don't know. But all we know is that if there is an idea to do things differently, it will definitely start in a think tank. Thank you very much, and have a great evening.